It's okay for Canada to say, what's in it for us? What are our interests here? What are our values in doing this? What's our foreign policy? How do we think of this strategically? How do you explain to Canadians why it is that we're spending billions of dollars to support Ukraine? And if those kinds of answers to those kinds of questions aren't easy to come, I think we should think about that. And we should talk about that because Canadians need to support it. And I think this has been at the core of why the Canadian Forces has been left to atrophy for such a long period of time, is we haven't taken the time to explain why all these things matter.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, August 15th, 2025. My good colleague Gabriella Picton will be moderating today's panel.
We are providing additional military assistance, drones, helicopters, broader munitions, over $2 billion worth of assistance directly to Ukraine. And thirdly, we are dispersing the next tranche of the loan based on the frozen Russian assets, over $2 billion as well. This is our contribution. We'll be working with our European and other allies for their contributions to provide the support. And to be absolutely clear,
through Operation UNIFIER, Canada's ongoing support for Ukraine demonstrates the critical role of middle powers in combating contemporary security challenges. Since 2015, Op UNIFIER has provided training and advisory support to the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Helping to strengthen their capacity, the CAF has served as a bridge to increase Ukraine's interoperability with other NATO partners, particularly since Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion. The mission is adapted to sustain Ukraine's defense and institution reforms by moving to third country locations remaining under Canadian direction. In today's episode, Lieutenant Colonel Cole Petersen, Major General Bill Seymour, and Jill Sinclair examines Canada's unique contributions to building trust and capacity, the integration of new operational technologies like drones, and the challenges of adapting training and support to Ukraine's changing needs. This is the Expert Series.
Operation UNIFIER was launched 10 years ago in 2015. Could you begin by situating this decision in the context of the time and the Canadian government's thinking on why to initiate the mission at that specific moment? Jill, I would be particularly interested in hearing your take on this as we begin.
Well, thanks, Gabriella. Again, thanks for the invitation, and I'm thrilled to be here with Bill and Cole, who will be able to add a lot to this question and all the others. I'm going to take us back, maybe even a little bit beyond kind of that 10th anniversary, because there's a lot of forgetting of history or kind of facts these days, and so I think it's important to just remember that Canada's relationship with Ukraine goes back a long, long, long way. Obviously, there's the Ukrainian-Canadian connection, which is extraordinary. But I'm thinking about 1991, when Canada was the first Western country to recognize an independent Ukraine. Many listeners may not even remember that Ukraine was, part of the Soviet Union, but an independent Ukraine that was striving for democracy. And the relationship just went from strength to strength through there. And this sense of solidarity and working with a country that was working for itself to bring democracy and the rule of law and to build its security and its sovereignty and its territorial integrity, that is something that Canada supported from the very outset. So you kind of fast forward to 2015. And I think the really important thing to remember here is not just Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its unprovoked war on Ukraine, which then moved to a full-scale invasion, as we know, in 2022. But it's to reflect that this was a Ukrainian request. And I think whenever we talk about Op UNIFIER and so many of the things that we do with Ukraine, it's important to remember that actually the Ukrainians knew that they needed this help. This is an innovative, agile, determined country and people, from civil society through to government and the armed forces. This is an armed forces that was coming out of the Soviet era. They needed, and you've talked a little bit about this in your introduction, how to be interoperable with NATO. And we mustn't forget that even as recently as the last NATO summit, NATO allies agreed that Ukraine's future is in NATO. So this is a partner. So in 2015, this visceral, practical reaction by the Canadian government of the time to say, We are going to help you do what you need in order to be more operationally effective, more professional. We are going to send our trainers who are the best in the world, and we're going to work with partners. You mentioned NATO. We did this in partners. This was a collective alliance reaction, but Canada was there in 2015, and we decided that we would stay with this. This is a commitment over the long haul to help Ukraine be sovereign, independent, and to have a very effective fighting force as a deterrent to future aggression. I'm sure my colleagues will have lots to add on that.
I think that was a great introduction there, Jill. And like you and Cole, I'm really happy to be here. And I wanted to just mention this to congratulate Cole on turning over command of one PPCLI and his command of Task Force Unifier. He did a great job there, and I heard that feedback personally from a number of folks. Just to build on what you're talking about, Jill, the context of the time, and I think it's also useful to think of the follow-on activities that took place. The stand-up of Operation Reassurance, the mission to Latvia, the air task force that was deployed to Romania to bolster NATO's sort of southeastern flank, and the range of activities across the board. Political, diplomatic, and including the military, which we're focused on here, all came together to sort of bolster Western action in the face of Russian aggression. So this was a great example of that. But in a broader context, there was a range of activities that took place that reinforced the one aspect that we're focusing on here today, which is Operation Unifier. That's what I'd add to that.
Yeah, there's not much I can add. Just to riff off what Bill provided there, it's important to remember this was the first in a series of activities where the CAF reinforced NATO's eastern flank, and so it's got to be seen within that scope of activities, and we've been involved in those operations for a significant period of time, which shows the seriousness of our effort in Europe.
Now, since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, how has Operation Unifier evolved? For Bill and Cole in particular, I'm hoping you can help situate us in how the current context has shifted the operation's direction or priorities.
Yeah, that's such a great follow-on to the first question, Gabriella. And this is just remarkable story, I think, for a number of reasons. But in the way that positioned to allow it to respond to Ukrainian requirements and adapt, and then Cole will amplify that from his perspective on the actions and decisions taken for Op UNIFIER post Russian invasion. But from the outset, it was sort of a vertically integrated mission to bolster Ukraine's capacity. So I think at the strategic level, Jill's work that came with the Defense Reform Advisory Board for senior Ukrainian leadership on defense reform. There were institutional aspects through a Global Affairs Canada, multiple Global Affairs Canada initiatives aimed at providing Ukraine's support for building institutional capacity building. And then going back to the sort of military side, Operation Unifier was also supplemented by something called the Multinational Joint Commission that I joined when I became the deputy commander in 2018. But the Multinational Joint Commission was an oversight body and worked with a number of the allies, call it a coalition of the willing, that included the US, the UK, Canada, Denmark, Poland, later Sweden, and a few other countries, Slovakia near the end, who came together to provide that direct support to Ukraine in that sort of direct training piece. And then at the tactical level, Operation Unifier was supplemented by the U.S. Operation, which was focused on training and capacity building, the UK's Operation Orbital. So when you think about that strategic, operational, and tactical activity, all of those things came together to really support Ukraine. You support Ukraine's ask in those early days. Throughout the entire mission, I've always called it an adaptive training mission. Op UNIFIER has adapted brilliantly, I think, to Ukraine's articulated needs. So I think of the Multinational Joint Commission's role in that. We met with senior Ukrainian leadership twice a year. We heard feedback from them. We got reports on how the training was evolving. We were in regular touch, of course, with each task force commander and got feedback from them. And so it was adapted training mission, not just to the land domain in terms of what the land task forces were doing, but we also did Air Force work. It was a joint operation in a number of ways. The Air Force provided flight safety training. The CAF provided medical training across the board. In the later stages of the operation, we were spooling up naval capacity building to the Ukraine's naval forces working out of Odessa down in the south. And we also brought on, I think to great benefit for us and for Ukraine, but we also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ukraine's National Guard. And so we were not only just training their land forces, we trained the National Guard. The National Guard were incredible partners. I mean, they took what we offered and they applied it and they adapted and they learned and they kept asking for more. It was just such a great example of the kind of things that we've seen with Operation UNIFIER and our partners. I think the third point that I would make on that is that as we work with Ukraine, it wasn't, as I sort of said earlier, like a wash, rinse, and repeat type thing. We kept training tactical level troops as they climbed up the capability ladder, as they became more proficient in things. Each 6-month rotation of Op UNIFIER sort of helped climb up that capability ladder. We got more involved. We got more sophisticated. We helped them with more and more complex kind of training maneuvers, those kinds of things. And the other really cool thing, and this is like a Canadian thing, every task force had a different flavor because the organizations that supported the task force, and they came from all across the CAF. But if it's an artillery-focused task force, they would do some artillery things. If engineers were leading this and were the core of it, engineers would do things. We also branched out into NCO training and NCO leadership, visited the NCO academies and leadership at the officer level. So every task force over that 6-month period hit multiple aspects beyond just that sort of core field training to sort of climb up that ladder of the operational level. And the MJC saw this and worked that and reinforced it with Ukraine and with Ukraine's active involvement. So it was a constantly adapting mission up until the point that the Russians invaded and we pulled out. And then Cole's turn there, I think he'll tell you a similar story. But over to you, Cole.
Yeah, so when it comes to tactical execution of the Op UNIFIER mission, the full-scale invasion in 2022 is really an inflection point for the mission. For the first 7 years, it's what we refer to in the CAF as UNIFIER 1, and that was where we had forces in the country of Ukraine. They were in the schools and on the bases, leading training efforts there. And after the invasion, just prior to the invasion, we pulled forces out along with the rest of our allies and partners for obvious reasons. And then what slowly started to build was what we call Op UNIFIER 2. And that's the mission to support Ukraine outside of Ukraine. And so the operating concept really changed in that instead of working on Ukrainian bases and in Ukrainian schools, we would deliver training and support by, with, and through our other allies and partners in Europe. And we would deliver the specific tactical requests of the Ukrainians based on how the war was progressing. So the key there is that there's essentially third parties in the sense that Canada is obviously far away from Ukraine. We can't do something like the UK or Poland does, where they could pull Ukrainians in and deliver everything for themselves. We would have to partner up with some of our allies and go to deliver specific requested training in a partnership. So this really changed our operating concept in that we had to work with partners to find locations for where our operations were to be conducted. We had to develop partnerships in terms of who did what exactly. And finally, we had to work within the coalition construct to find out what exactly those training needs were. And so there's a bit of process to that. So it really evolved into an effort. When I commanded Unifier, we were spread across Europe in 5 countries, which was a pretty large span of control geographically. And we were working with 3 different nations in their countries, but also had numerous other partners, mostly NATO nations, involved in day-to-day training. So it took on a lot more of a multinational flavor in this Unifier 2 construct.
Gabriella, maybe I can just add a couple of words to Bill and Cole's really great laydown here. This idea that the mission, that Op UNIFIER was a dynamic mission from the very beginning. I love that term, Bill, that you use, an adaptive training mission. Even before the full-scale invasion, we have to again remember that Ukraine, was forced into a war posture by Russia many years before 2022, right? And there was always this sort of synergistic kind of learning that was going on. But, Bill talked a little bit about the work that I was doing with the Defense Reform Advisory Board. That was at the strategic level. Again, this was an initiative of the Ukrainians. It reported directly to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. It was established by the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. We worked at that level and with the Chief of Defense and with other ministers and senior level folks. But the reason I talk about this here is that every time I would go to Kyiv to do my work, which was on a monthly basis, the first thing I would do would be to talk to the task force commander, because I wanted the ground truth. I wanted to understand what was going on at the tactical level and to try to link that to what we were hearing at the institutional level. And a lot of the disconnects Bill talked about, like NCO training or the medical training we were doing. Well, some of the stuff that we were trying to do at the tactical level was actually impeded by things that just didn't exist at the institutional level. For example, there was no legislation in place that sort of let medics do what they needed to do in the field for military, purposes. And so we had to work with the Ministry of Health to get that changed so that the folks in the Ukrainian Armed Forces could then use the training that we were offering them at the tactical level through Op UNIFIER. Same thing with professional military education. If you wanted to professionalize the education system, well, it used to be owned entirely by the Ministry of Education. That wasn't working so well for the armed forces and the security forces. So understanding what the challenges were at the tactical level by talking to the folks at OPU who were speaking with all of their Ukrainian counterparts, we were then able to bring those issues to the institutional level. And then you've got this kind of synergistic, system going that lets you make the improvements to actually get full value for folks at the tactical level and for our folks that were doing the training through OPU. Over.
I'm hoping we can now elaborate further on the foundational goals of Op UNIFIER in its early stages and how those might have shifted in the current conflict environment. Bill and Cole, if you'd like to continue focus on the operation itself. Jill, I'd love to hear from you on broadening our scope and maybe about the implications or impacts at the government-to-government level between Canada and Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gabriella. I think the first thing I think of in this case is it's got to be strategic. Deterring Russia's aggression from further aggression. I think that was really important. Op UNIFIER was sort of a lead mark or a signature sort of effort in that regard in its early stages, and also the capacity building piece. The capacity building fundamentally at Ukraine's request on the things that they needed to bolster their ability to deal with aggression in its sort of existing form, but continue to fight the kinds of things that have been going on and build their capacity to support the defense of their country, particularly in the East and the Donbass, as it evolved. And then the shift, I think, to the sort of post-invasion context. It's gone beyond the deterrence phase because we haven't deterred the Russians. We're trying with NATO to deter them more broadly from adventurism, if you will, in greater Europe. But I think the fight has become more fundamental for Ukraine. It's an existential fight now. And so we're not just building the capacity to deter or deal with Russian aggression. We are fundamentally helping them in many ways deal with an existential issue. And that it affects the flavor of the operation. It affects the focus of the operation. It impacts the urgency of the operation. It impacts, I think, the way we need as a nation to think about what we're doing and how we're supporting Ukraine, and how that connects more broadly to what NATO is doing and what our next step should be over in time. I think perhaps Cole might have a perspective on this one as well.
So those foundational goals have remained pretty consistent, but how they're translated through the lens of what's actually going on the ground is pretty important. So they starting from 2022 on, the Ukrainian military began to mobilize, and that has had a huge impact on what the tactical goals of the mission are, because you've gone from a force that was fairly static in its size, even though it was fighting a conflict from 2014 on in the east, to one that's mobilized from about 28 active maneuver brigades to over 120. So you've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of people that are serving, and then the demand to get people into the military. That demand signal has really changed the tenor of how we deliver support to Ukraine.
I think it's also exposed for the Ukrainians opportunities. There's been lots of discussion and work to address the fact that they're not entirely a joint force. They've asked multiple times through various venues, both when I was serving on the MJC and sort of follow on, to help them think through what a joint force structure looks like, and joint force capabilities, and a joint force fight. And that is there. And then the things that Jill talked about, those institutional things, as a war occurs and as a nation comes together to deal with this existential challenge, things within their governmental structure, the legislation, it exposes a number of weaknesses on that front. And Canada's been helping in some of those areas, but by gosh, there's a ton more demand and a ton more things that need doing in this sort of context as we look ahead. So that's another thought there.
And I can kind of build on what Bill has said here and Cole's comments. And that is the sort of the wider context evolves. I guess I'm a little bit obsessed, Gabriella, by going, just reminding people Ukraine is, Russia is at war on Ukraine. Because we forget this. And just to think about the evolution of the training mission from a not full-scale invasion to a full-scale invasion, and that mobilization piece that Cole was talking about. But in terms of some of the wider aspects of it, Canada's overall defense, security, political, economic relationship with Ukraine was evolving at the same time. So 2017, we had a memorandum of understanding between, the Department of National Defense and the Ukrainian Ministry of National Defense for cooperation. Fast forward a few years to 2024, and all G7 countries are negotiating a full-scale strategic security partnership arrangement with Ukraine, and Canada has its own strategic security partnership arrangement with Ukraine. Extremely important, and it provides for everything from continuing tactical level training, things like Operation UNIFIER, but to everything else that you need to enable that training to be effective. Right, so that's the institutional piece. It's the providing lethal and non-lethal equipment piece. It's the C2 piece. It's the reform piece. It's all of those other pieces. So a much more comprehensive and integrated framework was being developed at the same time as Operation UNIFIER was evolving to meet the needs of the folks in the field. And again, Bill and Cole can speak to this. I'll just mention it, and they might want to grab onto it. But just the new types of warfare that the Ukrainians were bringing back to the trainers to say, hey, you know what, we just built this kind of drone in our garage and we deployed it and, we took out the Moskva. I mean, there's stuff there that had to be, factored in to the training. So a very, very dynamic kind of environment.
And this, I think, leads into our next question and discussion, but the sort of the new ways of warfare that have manifested themselves since the Russian invasion. I think Op UNIFIER paid attention to this beforehand because, whenever you put people together, you learn from the people that you're working with. You learn from the people that you're teaching, and there's teaching both ways. There are always these kinds of things. And I recall many times individuals told me what they had gleaned, not just from a cultural and a relational kind of perspective in dealing with another culture, which you learn to respect the Ukrainians, but the things that if you're open to it, you take away from that experience. And then we talked many times at the MJC with the Ukrainians about sharing their experiences from the Donbass in the sort of mid-early days of Op UNIFIER. And in a lot of ways, I think that they're reticent and reluctant because intelligence, secrets, those kinds of things, the mechanisms hadn't necessarily been put in place. And there are people that take time to trust people. And I think we built that trust up over a period of time. But since the invasion, that's where the really rich discussion about these kinds of things occurs. And maybe Cole has a thought about what I just said, or we can move to the next question.
Yeah, we're gonna transition to talking about operational lessons learned here?
Yes.
So,
and why don't I just begin there, Cole, just to sort of frame it. And in that sort of pre-invasion phase, I don't know whether they're operational or doctrinal things. There's certainly some things there. Reinforcing jointness within the Canadian Forces for an organization that wasn't joint. And I think in a lot of ways, it sort of forced us to ask questions for ourselves about what jointness meant for us and how it manifested and how we prepared for a fight, not just the pre-invasion fight, but the kinds of things that might come should Russia become more aggressive. I think the other piece is, and I think of this, I mentioned this like from an individual level, but, to go in and be humble as a people, and this is the Canadian forte, to go in and go, well, I know everything, and I'm going to show these Ukrainians. It wasn't like that at all. From my experience, there is that we go in with a view to understanding where people's capabilities are at, and work to bolster that. But at the same time, work to understand. I think one example, and this was really telling, it was one of the other task forces, and they were doing some sort of an operation where they're setting their vehicles up in a certain way. And the Ukrainians said, well, if you do it that way, all your vehicles are going to be destroyed in no time. And the nation sort of thought about that and go, yeah, you're kind of right. It was pretty telling of things. And so whenever you put yourself in a position where you're going to build capacity of another nation's armed forces, your own capacity and your own thinking gets challenged in that regard. And it ultimately trickles down, whether or not it's operational or doctrinal, but there were certainly lessons that came from the early phases of Op UNIFIER. Shaping its force posture, I'm not so sure. But the post-invasion space, that's where it's really rich. And perhaps, Cole, you could talk about that.
Yeah, so this is the largest land war in Europe since 1945. So there's obvious implications for all militaries. What I compare this to is the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, because that war influenced military thinking for decades after that war. I mean, the Americans led study. NATO doctrine flowed from it. And what you saw in the Gulf War in 1991-92 was the outcome of that. So this war is doing the same. And what we're learning from the Ukrainians and watching in Ukraine is going to influence the CAF and our allies and partners for decades. We need to be careful. That's something I did learn. a lot of pundits and folks say this is a revolution, everything's changed, but you see a lot of continuity in what we're observing. And also, I think that you need to be careful messages that a lot of what we see, especially in this information-rich environment with social media, is curated, and it's curated to provide a specific message. So in working with Ukrainians and learning from them, we're able to sift through all those observations and insights that they're learning every day as they defend their country. Obviously, there's some novel application. Drones will capture everyone's imagination. Their proliferation in the battlefield is evident. We see it every day if you flip on a social media channel. But like I said, we need to be careful because they're not decisive. The war is still going on, and the front line is not moving very fast. So I would say since 2022, much of what we're observing is confirming what we actually knew. And I won't say we forgot it, but it's stuff we parked for the 10 to 20 years we were involved in places like the Balkans and in Afghanistan. And so we're learning those aspects of large scale combat operations that are at the core of what the Canadian Armed Forces prepares to do. Things like artillery kills, and artillery is very important. These are very tactical things. Attrition happens in the battlefield, and you have to plan for it. Sustainment is challenging, very challenging to do when you have an adversary that tries to stop you from doing it. And combined arms work of all the teams. Bill mentioned the joint fight. That's essential. And so for the CAF, continuing to develop what we know by working on our force structure and working on fighting at scale is key. And that's what I think the lesson we're drawing from this. The Ukrainians have difficulties with this at times, fighting at large scale. This is not a secret. It's well publicized. It's difficult to do when you're taking casualties and trying to do this under contact. And this is where alliance integration is the key for us. This is with reassurance in our commitment now a brigade to Eastern Europe. We're practicing and training on this stuff all the time. So pulling those lessons is helping us from in preparing to and training with our allies in Eastern Europe. One of the key lessons, and you see this in a lot of discussions and conversations and thought pieces, is on resiliency, and resiliency throughout all levels of an armed force, down to the lowest level, the resiliency of the personnel. We watch the Ukrainians work on this. They've brought resiliency down to their basic training as a specific program where you prepare people for what is entailed in fighting in the front line and fighting in a trench and having drones overhead at all times. So working on the resiliency of your personnel. Also with the medical training, of which our mission is the key contributor. Sustaining our people, treating them if they're injured, getting them evacuated. That whole system of resiliency of personnel is a big takeaway. Resiliency of materiel, as we've seen, the donation of materiel to sustain the war effort of the Ukrainians is a key thing. And now we're going through this process in Canada as well. How do we sustain a fight that's longer than 30 days and consumes vast amount of material, ammunition, parts, vehicles, uniforms, et cetera. And then the final piece of resiliency, I think, is on your formations themselves. You're preparing a large group of people to potentially go into combat operations. How do you sustain that organization? And I'm not just talking about physical material that's in the organization, but the organization itself. How do you sustain a large combat organization in operations for an extended period of time against an adversary? So these are all observations that are being pulled from the fight. The Ukrainians are telling us a lot of this, and we're winding this and weaving this into everything we do in the CAF to be prepared should Canada require us to do something of a similar magnitude.
Gabriella, if I can just add a little bit to Cole's fabulous kind of laydown. Just so interesting, Cole, to hear you explain this, to us again. And it really is, it's quite extraordinary what Op UNIFIER is doing. I just wanted to mention, too, that, of course, Canada, part of NATO, we're always with our allies. And NATO itself, I mean, back in 2023, NATO produced a Russia war against Ukraine lessons learned curriculum guide. Okay, that was 2023. There's now a unit, there's a cell in NATO that is working specifically with the Ukrainians to capture, to analyze, and then hopefully to institutionalize those lessons learned across the alliance. Because, of course, we are looking for an interoperable Ukraine working with NATO, and we're always looking to enhance our interoperability within the NATO alliance. And we know that we are doing that in a very real and changed dynamic security environment, which at the moment sees Russia waging war on Ukraine. But as Bill has mentioned, it's this deterrent posture, and we have to learn, and we have to be in this continual learning mode. And so NATO is doing that daily with the Ukrainians.
Gabrielle, maybe one thing to add there, just to reinforce what Cole talked about. I think in some ways, and this isn't a CAF thing, although it touches on the CAF, but it's a whole of government piece. The way the whole of government activity was working is, and as Jill sort of said to me quite some time ago, Ukraine is a whole of government poster child. I think the war has challenged the whole of government aspect of things because we can't send people in to do some of the stuff that we were doing. But one thing sort of comes to mind, having worked the non-lethal aid piece for quite some time through the mechanisms that existed in Canada, I think we were caught without a ready mechanism to deliver lethal aid. And we scrambled, I think, as a nation to get Ukraine the things that they needed, both from within our inventory, but from within Canadian industry. And I think that there's a big lesson, I think, to be learned from that. And I think that the government is working on addressing things from an industrial capacity perspective, not just to supply the Canadian forces, but to think more holistically of what future conflict, which seems increasingly likely depending on what you read and what you believe, to prepare Canada for. So I think that that's another thing to consider more strategically.
Now, keeping impacts on the CAF's development and learning in mind, as we've discussed, more broadly, what does Canada gain, whether it be strategically, militarily, or diplomatically, from its continued investment in Operation UNIFIER? Jill, if you maybe want to start us off on this.
Oh, thanks, Gabrielle. I have to start by sort of saying that this isn't about us gaining something for us. Let's remember that this fight that Ukraine is engaging with extraordinary resilience, as Cole has just spoken. I mean, this is a fight for democracy. I don't want to be over sound a little bit Pollyannish here. But honestly, this is a fight for democracy. It's a fight for territorial integrity. It's a fight to maintain the integrity of the UN Charter and that whole post-Second World War order that was established and which we know is fraying and fractured, but there are very important parts of it that we have to hang on to. So what does Canada gain from this? Well, it's the ultimate forward defense, right? That Ukraine is doing on our behalf. We talk about an enhanced forward presence, and our reassurance is terrific, and that's really important. But Ukraine is literally on those front lines. So her fight is our fight, obviously. In terms of the diplomatic, I mean, I think that this is where Canada's Canada's skill at working in partnership with partners, not just allies, but those who are like-minded. I mean, just think of, Japanese and the Koreans and Australians and New Zealanders. There are a lot of countries that see the importance of the effort that the community of like-minded is engaged in working with Ukraine. So that is absolutely something to our net benefit, that there is really an alliance with a small a of solidarity that understands that there are still some principles, there's some international principles, and that getting together and doing concerted action, and whether it's from sanctions or infrastructure development or lethal, material, as Bill was speaking about, these are all things that are strengthening us. They are making us more agile. They are enabling us to be, if maybe not yet more resilient, but to understand that these are things that we have to work on and that we have forgotten at our peril. So that's a very kind of high level answer. I'd really love to hear what Cole and Bill have to say to your really great question. Over.
Yeah, it is a great question. Let me just slide in there. I'd said to offer about, I think, three things is that I think the first is that anytime you come together internationally, multinationally, be it tactically, operationally, or strategically, as you work with people and you build relationships, you build trust, you build those connections, you build the sinews of the ability to work together, to know what your allies are thinking and doing. And I think that's been a benefit, much to Russia's sort of disappointment, is they were trying to degrade NATO by eroding the trust and the relationships. Instead, they've strengthened those. I think we've all benefited from that. I think the second piece is that, and Cole might expand on this, he touched on it already, but at that sort of CAF level, and we saw this even before the war, we were learning things about cyber. We were learning things about information operations. We're learning things on C4ISR, the ability to sort of sense, make sense, and then act on things, not just as a force, but as a nation to sort of see that the instruments of national power can be brought together to do and accomplish things. The drones piece is such a great example. And I think we're working on that to distill that as much as we can. But the other thing I think that Canada gains from that is, the fundamental importance of Canada understanding what its interests are, what its values are, and where it sits in the global order. Reading the news again yesterday, the discussion within certain quarters in the U.S. about this is Europe's war, not America's war. I think Canada's taken a position whereas this is the West's war, it's the world's war, because Russia's ambition won't be constrained. And I think that as we think through things, it's okay for Canada to say, what's in it for us? What are our interests here? What are our values in doing this? What's our foreign policy? How do we think of this strategically? How do you explain to Canadians why it is that we're spending billions of dollars to support Ukraine? And if those kinds of answers to those kinds of questions aren't easy to come, I think we should think about that and we should talk about that because Canadians need to support it. And I think this has been at the core of why the Canadian Forces has been left to atrophy for such a long period of time, is we haven't taken the time to explain why all these things matter and why it's in Canada's interest, why it affects Canada's values, what is our role in the global order, and what does the contribution like Op UNIFIER actually do for us? Why are we doing this? That's an important discussion. Over.
Yeah, and I think it's important, as Jill pointed out, to just re-emphasize that the CAF is in this for the Ukrainians. And any benefits we do achieve, it's because we are thinking and we're working to support the Ukrainians. And but out of that, a lot comes. There's a lot of benefits for our soldiers, our sailors, and our aviators. From my experience as the task force commander, it was usually rewarding because you are literally, you're not at the front, but you are literally part of one of the key events of our time and probably of our generation. A lot of my members reported the same, regardless of where they worked at the task force. To provide some context, so a week after we arrived, the Russians struck a maternity hospital in Kyiv with a missile. And those kind of things really reinforced the why to the soldiers who were, and sailors and aviators who were part of Joint Task Force Ukraine. And then when they go out, and whether they're training or working to provide material donations and move that material to the Ukrainians, they're interacting with the members of the armed forces of Ukraine. And those people, just through their interactions, they'll develop relationships. And a lot of my members, they would tell me about their interactions and the relationships they built. And these are the people that are, like us, just want to live their life, and they want to be able to raise their family, to work, to send their kids to school without having to worry about a missile coming through it. So providing that to defend their country was a real tangible thing that all the members of my task force felt they were contributing to. And they would hear that from the Ukrainians. It was mentioned earlier, the Canadian Armed Forces provides a high caliber instructor, and the Ukrainians knew that, and humbleness was key. A lot of my people would come in and they'd say, well, I'm going to teach a Ukrainian NCO who's been on the front line for 2+ years. What can I teach that person? But when you bring humbleness in and say, hey, here's what I know, here's what I can teach you, and perhaps that is a tool for your tool belt. And they find that approach works. So in terms of interacting with allies and partners, that's another benefit, because in working with the Ukrainians and working with all the other nations that are supporting Ukraine, it really gives our people a sense of where they fit in the big alliance and within NATO, and how good our people actually are, because while they're not on the front line, they're supporting those on the front line, and they're able to bring something of value that the Ukrainians recognize, and the Ukrainians tell us that they appreciate. So I'd say all my soldiers left feeling like they had contributed to something worthwhile, which is hugely important I'm sure for most of them.
That's great.
Yeah.
As we've touched a bit on Canada's understanding uniquely of the post-2022 conflict in Ukraine as the world's war, I want to now shift our focus to the multinational character of the effort. Could you speak a bit about how Canada's partnership with allies have evolved from the early stages of Op UNIFIER into the present day? I'm happy for whoever would like to jump in and start with this one, perhaps maybe Cole to start us with current cooperation, and then we can look back and broaden our scope a bit further.
Sure. One thing that was really important was the creation of a coalition organization to rope in all the support that was pledged to Ukraine after 2022. And so the CAF has been a pretty big contributor to this effort. It started with the Security Assistance Group Ukraine, SAGU, which is located in Germany. And very early on, the CAF took a leading role, especially in the training pillar. We have a general officer in that headquarters who essentially led the effort to coordinate training support to Ukraine. An important part about Op UNIFIER is that it's not a NATO mission. It's not an alliance mission. It's a national mission. And so as the task force commander, I responded directly to my national chain of command through Commander Sejock. However, if Ukraine receives support from 28 or 30 or whatever national missions, that's not going to be a very cohesive support base. So that headquarters SAGU was designed to act as a single interface with Ukrainians so that they could transmit their requirements, whether that be a training or material or any other types of support, to an organization that would process it, work with them to refine it, and then bring it out to the coalition to determine who was best situated to provide whatever that was. And so again, Canada took a lead in the training arm. We have people in the other elements of that organization, and that is how we are doing this multinational security force capacity building effort day to day in getting the request from the Ukrainians, bringing it through that organization that will refine it, and then finding a country that can best deliver that support. And it may not be one country. Many of our efforts are delivered as a consortium of 2, 3, 4, 5 countries that all agree to deliver a specific effect. That organization, though, it did change last year during my time over there. It became the NATO mission and SACU. And so now NATO has taken that mantle of providing that interface between Ukraine and all the supporting countries. And so that's, I think, is a really unique multinational way of bringing together many countries with many different strengths and many different capabilities to offer, and putting them through a system and a process so that Ukraine can get what it needs at the right time. And the fact that we have a leading role in there is I think a great reflects well upon the CAF, but it's also a testament to the quality of our people, and also it benefits the CAF to be involved in something so important and so strategically vital to our country and to our relationships.
And there's more to say from the pre-invasion perspective. And so I've talked a bit about the Multinational Joint Commission, and that was a precursor, I think, to some of those structures that were set up to support multinational efforts there. And the MJC had a number of partners to begin with, and that grew over time as the success of the operation became more known, and the sort of nations wanted to come on board. So that was a great mechanism to support what was going on. One of the great examples, I think, of what the MJC would do is to discuss amongst the partners what they were doing training-wise. And we learned that different countries were coming in to teach the same subject, but we're teaching different things. And so we streamlined the syllabus, if you will, so that everybody was teaching the same stuff. We're all contributing, but if we're going to teach artillery training, we're teaching from the same sort of doctrine and syllabus. And so we harmonized some of that kind of stuff. And later on, within the pre-invasion unifier piece, we took the lead, Canada, to set up a multinational coordination center in downtown Kiev that Canada helped staff. And the aim there was to address overlap and to work together to better support what Ukrainians are doing. So that was an important effort there as well. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Hi, Gabriele. Just again, Bill and Cole have covered everything so well, but the evolution also included things like the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. And of course, it was very interesting. I think we've almost forgotten because we lived it in real time. But at the beginning, it was a sort of an ad hoc multinational, effort, and countries like Canada and then the United States and the UK and the Poles, the Lithuanians. I mean, everybody just saying, okay, we just got to do what we need to do. And very quickly it became apparent that needed to be coordinated for the purpose of coherence, obviously, to make sure that Ukraine got what she needed, but also just to make sure that we didn't have the Ukrainians spending all their time trying to coordinate with us, right? And so it was as much a requirement for us for effective and efficient delivery, understanding the requirement, and then getting the stuff to the Ukrainians, as making it more efficient and effective for them in the midst of the fight. But over time, I mean, Bill did incredible work at the MJC, which, informed a lot of what came afterward. And he would never say it, but he was a real leader and therefore made Canada a leader at that table. But the Ukraine Defense Contact Group is now 57 odd countries, I think. The UK has taken over the kind of the chair of that, the leadership of that. And I think it's fair to say that it's a pretty refined multinational effort now. And some of those lessons were learned from, what we did with Afghanistan, where it was a much wider coalition of partners that would even come to the NATO meetings. But I think we're understanding that you need coherence, you need kind of a single portal and a single kind of focal point, both for those who want to support, but for those who want to feed in their requirements. So there's fairly, I think, important lessons to be learned from the evolution in the multinational effort. And then, of course, beneath that sort of 57 or however many countries you want to count around that table, virtual and real, are all the mini-lateral relationships. So again, Cole and Bill have spoken a bit about this, but there was, Canada, US, Canada, UK, Canada, Lithuania, or those other sort of smaller groups with the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Canadians working together. So it's all about cooperation and partnership. That's the only way that this has been effective to date. Over.
We're reaching the end of our very excellent discussion today. So, to reflect a bit on Operation UNIFIER, do you think that it tells us anything about what Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces specifically or uniquely bring to this sort of international efforts, whether it be training, capacity building, or otherwise? Happy for perhaps Cole and Bill to take the lead on this question.
Go ahead, Cole.
I think the key word here is relevance. If you look down into the task force, into the individual CAF members who are doing this day in and day out, is that we remain relevant and important in the world, and that everywhere you go, people want Canadians there. They want what our people bring to the fight, figuratively. Highly educated, highly trained, humble, and able to work with any ally or partner that needs our help. And Op UNIFIER, 10 years, that's what we brought up at the beginning. I commanded the 18th rotation, the 20th rotation's going in. This mission is, and it doesn't show any sign of going away soon. So this mission is part of the CAF, and it's not only deliver what we do, but it's also going to be part of our history, and I think it will show that when another country, another democracy, and other people needed help, the Canadians and the Canadian Armed Forces were one of the first to show up. Over.
Yeah, it's great. Let me jump in there. And I think that there's a number of things about Op UNIFIER that make it special. And I'll elaborate just a bit more on the international stuff. But, that Canadianness of the relationship between Canada and Ukraine. I went to school on the prairies and I learned French from Mrs. Prepashewski. So it was kind of a great cultural thing to say, and then go to descend on that milieu and talk to people where there was sort of a shared understanding. I think Canada brings that across the board. I've traveled to Canadian Forces operations around the world, and so many times I've been approached by countries who've told me in confidence, and this isn't something they sort of say to everybody, kind of go, hey, like amongst the various partners there, we'd really like to work with Canada. And they mentioned a couple of other countries, some of whom have been mentioned here, but inevitably people would come and go, we'd really like to partner and work with Canada. And so you got to ask, why is that? And Cole touched on those kinds of things, but the fact that we as a people, that people to people connection, that we respect other countries, that we join in partnership, not to sort of impose, hey, look at us, we'll teach you and we'll show you stuff, and sort of denigrate the capabilities of the locals. But there's a respect there inherent in Canada's approach to doing things. And that has huge value when it comes to working with countries around this increasingly fragile, dangerous, disrespecting sort of global environment. And I think that's really important. And I think it's pretty special. I commend again Cole for the great leadership that he applied there, and for the incredible work that Jill did with Ukraine over time. And this has been such a valuable and such an enjoyable conversation. Thanks so much, Gabriella, for leading us through it. Over to Jill. I know you got some thoughts on this.
Thanks, Bill. And hard to add to these two amazing leaders, I have to say. But Bill talked about the Canadianness, and I think it's important to unpack that a little bit. And both Bill and Cole spoke about trust. Not only are we trusted, but we are seen as trustworthy. Not only are we valued, but we are seen as value added, because there is something quite different, and I would say unique and special, about what CAF brings to these missions. Nations want to work with CAF. They want to partner with CAF because of that humility that comes from a country that is a NATO ally, a founding NATO ally. And that, let's, again, a little bit of history. 81 years ago, was it Juno? D-Day. We have a track record here, okay? And maybe we've had ups and downs and how the military's been supported and not. But this is not something that comes out of nowhere. There's a rich history, and we can, of course, go back to the First World War, too. But so I think that professionalism, that raw professionalism, refined professionalism that Canada brings and that CAF brings, it makes us an extraordinary partner. People know they are really getting the very best training when they're working alongside Canadians. And it comes, frankly, with none of that arrogance and that. This humility word has come through a number of times. Humility goes a long way to opening doors, to building trust, to sustaining partnerships. It's why Canada is able to convene and bring people together. It's why, we can lead from behind, and we can also lead from in front too. We're not shy about that. But I think that there is a real value added, and the Canadians can take absolute pride in the fact that this is what Canada brings. And it's bringing it to Ukrainians, a fellow democracy, in an existential fight for its future. And we know that we are joined in that fight together as trusted partners together. So, Canada, people want more Canada. They really do. And they certainly want Canadian Armed Forces trainers. So I have to thank Cole for his service. I have to thank Bill for his former service, and everybody who is serving now, because they are making an extraordinary contribution to global peace and therefore to our security. And thank you so much, Gabriella, for the conversation.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday, but over the summer we're taking a bit of a break and releasing one podcast a week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, please email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.